Welcome to this explainer. Picture this. You're standing on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean back in the mid-19th century, just staring out at these crushing, dark, totally unforgiving depths. Down beneath those waves, it's a chaotic world of immense pressure, freezing temperatures, and literally total darkness. Well, today, we're diving into humanity's thrilling battle against that very abyss. We're going to explore the incredibly dramatic, edge-of-your-seat story of laying the very first transatlantic telegraph cable. It was a massive, near-impossible undertaking that literally birthed the global network that you and I rely on every single day.
Okay, let's dive into this. I really want you to ground yourself in the harsh reality of the 1850s. Imagine if an urgent message took 10 whole days to arrive. Just think about the unbearable weight of that silence. If a major war broke out, if the stock market completely tanked, or, say, a massive ship sank right in the middle of the ocean, nobody on the other side of the world would know a single thing about it for nearly 2 weeks. That was the unyielding reality of global communication back then.
You see, at the time, communication was strictly physically bottlenecked by the speed of travel. And the steamship? That was the absolute fastest thing on Earth. Information could only move as fast as coal and steam could push a heavy wooden or iron hull across the violently unpredictable Atlantic. There was no beaming signals through the sky, no instant updates. If you had critical information to share across continents, it literally had to be loaded onto a boat and physically carried across thousands of miles of salt water.
But then, in walks an incredibly wealthy, visionary American businessman named Cyrus Field. He looks at this agonizingly slow system and asks a question that most people of his era considered, well, totally and medically insane. He asked, what if we could send messages under the Atlantic Ocean instantly? To the Victorian public, this was pure science fiction. No way, right? Field was proposing to manufacture thousands of miles of fragile wire, drop it 2 miles deep into pitch-black waters, and just kind of trust that the monstrous pressure and violent storms wouldn't instantly destroy the whole shebang.
Section 1. The Engineering Nightmare.
Having an idea is one thing, but actually executing it, that plunges us straight into the visceral, heavy, clanking industrial reality of 19th century Victorian engineering. These folks were facing a technical hurdle that seemed completely impossible before they could even unspool a single foot of wire. The very first roadblock? Insulation. How on earth do you keep a delicate electrical signal from immediately leaking into millions of gallons of highly conductive salt water? Well, the magical solution actually came from a newly discovered natural rubber called gutta percha. Made from the dried sap of trees native to Southeast Asia, it was waterproof, flexible, and most importantly, it insulated electricity perfectly. It was exactly the miracle material they needed to survive the deep ocean.
And this brilliantly illustrates how they actually built this thing. They had to create a heavily shielded, absolute beast of a cable. Right in the center, acting as the nervous system, you've got 7 twisted copper strands to carry the signal. Then comes that vital layer of gutta percha coating to keep the water out. Next, they wrapped it tightly in hemp for flexibility and a bit of cushioning. And finally, shielding the whole thing was heavy iron wire armor. Sure, it was strong, and yeah, it was flexible, but it created a massive new problem.
Because of all those heavy iron and copper layers, a 2,500-mile stretch of this cable weighed over 2,000 tons. Just let that horrifying number sink in for a second. 2,000 tons! That made the cable entirely too massive for any single ship on the face of the Earth to carry. Remember, we're in the 1850s here. The logistics of just moving this physical object were completely unprecedented.
To solve this colossal weight issue, the British and American governments actually struck a unique deal. They supplied 2 of their largest, most powerful naval warships, the HMS Agamemnon and the USS Niagara. The plan was, honestly, as brilliant as it was terrifying. They decided to load half of the enormous cable into the belly of each ship. Then, these 2 massive vessels would sail out together to the exact middle of the unpredictable Atlantic Ocean. Physically splice the 2 ends of the cable together right there in the open water, and then literally just sail in opposite directions, one heading back toward Ireland and the other toward Newfoundland.
Which leads us into Section 2, Man versus Ocean, Deep Sea Disasters. So, as you might imagine, trying to coordinate 2 massive wooden and iron sailing ships in the middle of the ocean, all while unspooling a fragile, insanely heavy wire, yeah, that didn't exactly go smoothly. The crews faced a brutal, exhausting string of defeats against a monstrous abyss. First up, in 1857, their attempt ended in total disaster when the cable snapped just off the coast of Ireland. Millions of dollars gone into the deep in a split second. Then they tried again in June of 1858, but a monstrous storm hit. The HMS Agamemnon, loaded with hundreds of tons of iron cable, got tossed around by giant waves. Those heavy coils inside the ship began to violently shift, nearly crushing the crew members and almost capsizing the entire vessel. Oh, and during that very same expedition, the cable snapped not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. At this point, the public was totally ready to write the whole thing off as a fool's errand.
But Cyrus Field, he absolutely refused to quit. By July of 1858, the battered, exhausted crews geared up for one last desperate attempt. And this time, against all odds, luck was finally on their side. The seas were eerily calm. Day after day, the heavy iron brakes on those ships hummed this steady, beautiful tune as the wire unspooled smoothly into the dark depths, dropping thousands of feet to the ocean floor without catching or snapping once.
And then the impossible actually happened. On August 5, 1858, the USS Niagara reached the shores of Newfoundland, and the HMS Agamemnon sailed right into the harbor in Ireland. The warships had done it. They had temporarily conquered the mighty ocean. For the very first time in the history of planet Earth, 2 continents were physically connected by a single thread of copper.
Moving on to Section 3, the 3-week triumph and the 2,000-volt mistake.
The euphoric global celebrations that followed that initial connection were absolutely legendary. I'm talking street parades in New York, fireworks everywhere, church bells ringing all across Britain. But we have to shift the narrative from those wild celebrations to a completely devastating and entirely self-inflicted disaster. See, the cable technically worked, but the reality of the physics was agonizing. Queen Victoria sent a 98-word congratulatory message to U.S. President James Buchanan. Just 98 words, but because the signal degradation was so intense over 2,000 miles of underwater wire, that tiny message took 16 hours and 30 minutes to transmit. So yes, they connected the continents in real time, but the actual signal was horribly, intensely slow.
Enter the project's overzealous chief electrician, a guy literally named Wildman Whitehouse. And yes, he lived up to the name. Whitehouse was convinced that the slow speed was simply because the signal was too weak. So, his proposed fix? He decided to force massive power through the delicate system to speed it up. He was absolutely 100% certain that blasting the cable with raw electricity was the silver bullet to speed up those transmission times.
So the crucial point is, he cranked the power up to an astonishing 2,000 volts. And guys, this was a fatal, catastrophic mistake. That massive surge of electricity was way too much for the delicate system to handle. The high voltage instantly heated up and completely fried that perfectly crafted gutta-percha insulation deep beneath the freezing ocean water.
Just 23 days after it was activated, to massive global fanfare, the cable went completely, utterly dead. This was the heartbreaking rock bottom of the entire project. All that money, all that unbelievable danger, completely erased. Naturally, the critics returned with an absolute vengeance. They mocked Cyrus Field mercilessly, and some even published claims that the entire endeavor had just been an elaborate hoax from the very start. No way, right?
But the story isn't over. Let's look at Section 4, the ultimate victory and legacy.
It was a really dark moment, but history definitely doesn't stop there. Because this story is about so much more than a failed 19th century experiment. It's really about the triumphant conclusion of a grand vision, and the astonishing, hidden reality of the modern digital world we interact with every single day. It took 8 more years of relentless fundraising and engineering tweaks, but finally, in 1866, they achieved the dream. Utilizing the SS Great Eastern, which was the world's largest steamship at the time, they laid a brand new, thicker, way better insulated cable across the ocean floor. It cost millions more dollars, but this time, it lasted. Cyrus Field's impossible vision was permanently realized.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the modern reality it reveals. We live in an era of satellites and Wi-Fi, right? So it's incredibly easy to just assume that the internet flies invisibly through the sky. But mind-blowingly, a staggering 99% of all international data, from your daily stock trades to your streaming movies, to this very explainer, still travels through physical, fiber-optic cables buried at the dark bottom of the ocean. The foundation laid by those stubborn Victorian engineers is literally the physical backbone of our digital lives today.
And get this, every single one of those modern cables follows the exact same underwater paths mapped out by those brave pioneers who faced down the crushing depths of the Atlantic. It really makes you wonder as we look at this final question, which other impossible Victorian engineering feats still silently run our modern world today?
It's a fascinating thought to leave you with, because technology isn't just about the future. It's deeply, deeply rooted in the dramatic struggles of our past. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you on the next deep dive.